Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome once again to another Cladding Matters. This is where we discuss all things cladding and also fire safety. We've got some excellent and interesting news coming our way. But first of all, as per normal, Hamish McClay.
Well, first of all, my apologies for us coming to you for so late today. There was some fascinating information coming through just as we managed to get together in the green room before we came out to say hello to you all. It's a happy new year because many of you we haven't spoken to since before Christmas. And I'll open it up. What we do is we've got some experts, and with what's been going on in the background, you don't want to be hearing much of what I have to say. But just as an interesting factor, have any of you listened to Prime Minister's Question Time of late or ever? I mean, the thing is, if you actually want to look at a comical feature, this is by far the best way you can actually look at something. Because what will happen at the moment, particularly, you have one party, which is the opposing party, not the governmental party, will be asking questions of the Prime Minister, and they're direct questions. Did you walk through the puddle on your way to work today? And he will actually find all sorts of reasons why, in actual fact, on his way because he had to go to Glasgow first, and he catch the underground across Glasgow and this train back down here, and then he'll get back to what he spoke about in the first place, and he doesn't mention anything about the puddle. Not that the puddle is important, of course, but Prime Minister's Question Time is a way of avoiding a direct answer to anything. Politicians are tremendous at it, and we actually notice it about the local council where Steve's at. You ask them something important about the devious nature of the building in which Steve rides. You speak to the head of the council about it, or his deputy and all the rest of it, and they will come up with all sorts of obscure, I've answered that question. But the last time they denied there was anything serious about the property in which you lived. And that seems to be the tone of the argument. And basically what we seem to have at the moment, the way people get out of a difficult situation is to either make a mockery. I mean, what the heck the Kama Sutra's got to do with anything that's going on in Parliament? God only knows, but you have to watch that section actually coming up from Prime Minister's Questions and Answers. But somehow or other, he will make a joke about something like that whilst not giving any concern about various serious matters. And it's exactly the same situation we have here. We have a very, very serious matter with a number of properties that we actually sort of have in this country, which needs some serious remediation going on with them. And in answer to that particular, you have people who make jokes about the whole thing rather than actually answering the question and having an adult conversation about it. And really, that's what we're speaking about today. So I will let Steve unload what's been happening in the background between when we last spoke to you and today.
Steve, I believe there are all sorts of things happening. Would you bring us up to speed?
Yes. So over the Christmas period and New Year, we've been campaigning quite hard against PAS 9980 because, as per the government's remediation acceleration plan, they want to make this guidance, this PAS 9980 we've been exposing over the last year, law. And what that we think means, although we haven't seen the clauses yet, is that they're closing off the route to get a full remediation under the Building Safety Act via the courts in favour of this tolerable risk standard, which has been largely rejected. And it's been largely rejected for good reason. One is it allows banned highly combustible material to stay on new buildings when the same material is banned or new. So you'd have to be a fire engineer to ask the question, if it's banned or new, why is this standard allowing it on existing? And worse, it doesn't need any fire performance test evidence to know the risk of leaving it on. So that's point one. Point two is it discourages investigations into unlawful construction. That's breaches of the building regulations at the time of build. And that obviously is in the interests of those that want to save money. And the PAS actually, I'll show you a quote, actually links it to saving money. And then 3, it allows, if there's no cheap way of fixing a problem, or proportionate, as they say, it allows them to mark it as done without doing anything, marking it as tolerable if there's no proportionate fix. Now, because of those 3 reasons, the insurers have rejected the standard, have proposed amendments to PAS. The Association of British Insurance have put in a statement that the government rejected that. Interestingly enough, the insurers are excluded from the working group on PAS, the stakeholder group, as are the consumer groups, the leaseholders and so on, that were in the first group, but in the first revision of PAS in 2022, but not in this 2025 group. Why are they being excluded, you might ask? But let's have a look in a bit more examples. So, Gareth, if you could get up the slides, let's have a look. So, this is why we need to care about PAS. So, in the developer contracts, which is basically developers say how many life endangering defects there are, we have the following very troubling stats, and this has been verified not only via the government but also via BBC Verify, because this went on the BBC National News. What we're saying here is 35% of Barra blocks of flats on the developer contract are life endangering, with life endangering defect rates. 43% of Bellway, 69% for Crest Nicholson, and 77% for Taylor Wimpey. Right now, that is very, very concerning. We do not then want a standard which ignores looking if there's any unlawful construction in any of those defects. That's what it does. So if we go to the next slide, let's have a look at an example from Royal Artillery Quays where I live. So this is a 16-story fire shaft. Now, this fire shaft is a single escape stair, which means it's the only way for people to get down from a height if there's a fire. Now, those X's on the screen you can see there are XPS Euroclass E panels. Those are the second most combustible panels in Europe to put on a high-rise block of flats. Those same XPS panels are banned on new buildings, and under this PAS standard, they're allowed to stay on, even though the PAS confirms, the fire risk assessment confirms that they don't know what the product is. There's no evidence to know the fire risk of leaving them on. That's a concrete example of why we're going to get permanently high insurance after 2 years of remediation. And the quote in the middle there, Fire Chiefs Council says fire shafts should be made of fully, not partially, of non-combustible materials. So therefore, you know, even the fire chiefs are saying this is a bad idea, and it's banned on you. So if we go to the next image, you can see the leading Grenfell inquiry counsel, Stephanie Barwise. She commented on the back of this exposure, which we did on the BBC News, of the PAS standard becoming law. The government want to sneak it in the remediation bill into law this year. And she says this is bad news. PAS 1980 is not based on compliance with regulations. Rather, it's a very crude form of wholly non-scientific risk assessment. That's very troubling that someone with that level of expertise is criticising it as being a non-scientific risk assessment, and it is non-scientific if there's no evidence to know the risk of leaving the materials that are banned on new buildings on. So that's very good for us, because we need experts to speak out. And we also had in the BBC piece David Jones, who is the president of the Institute of Construction Management, basically say it allows developers to game the system, and that was his words. And that is what we're seeing. They are allowing materials to stay on to save the money. But let's move on to see what the standard says about itself. So let's go to the next one. Right, so this is from the new version of the standard, PAS 1980. I've called it 2025, but it will actually go law. It will become law. The government get their way mid-year this year. Presumptions that because of experience of poor common practice across the sector, remember those stats I just showed you, the 77%, you know, of life endangering defect rates for Taylor Wimpey. So the PAS accepts, and there's some pretty dangerous stats out there. But then buildings cannot be considered to be built satisfactorily unless survey information suggests otherwise. And they're suggesting if you need a survey to investigate that, this will lead to undue conservatism and potentially unnecessary and costly work. So it's saying, yes, there's bad practice, but if you want to insist on a survey to investigate it, you're going to get unnecessary costly work. So they know about the dangerous defect rates. They know that a survey is probably the best thing to do. And they're saying, yeah, but that will lead to all this extra unnecessary and costly work. So they're linking safety to financial cost. And that's in the standard itself. And that will mean fire engineers are lent on by the developers to avoid looking into unlawful construction. And that is a problem for us all. And then if we go to the next slide, this is another part from the PAS, which is equally, well, they've actually put it in there equally. But so equally, it might be concluded that there are no proportionate actions that can be identified, which, if it's linked to cost, good value ways. In this case, the risk outcome simply means tolerable. As with low risk outcome, there needs to be a periodic review. But if the standard is always saying, well, if there's no proportionate actions, treat it as tolerable, i.e. don't do anything and treat it as done, then how's that ever going to change? So we've got a standard that ignores unlawful construction, and if there's no cheap way of fixing a life-endangering defect, then mark it as tolerable. So they completely stop these fire engineers doing the right thing. So that's basically the background, where I questioned the producer of the currently live standard, and his name's Colin Todd MBE, and he got an MBE for services to fire safety, and you would have thought, given that the insurers rejecting the standard is discouraging investigations into unlawful construction, it's marking things as tolerable if there's no cheap way of fixing it, I would get a good reply to him justifying it. Well, let's have a look at what he said. This is his reply. So on Christmas Day, he wrote a poem to me, mocking me and making me out amongst my peers. And remember, this is very serious because I'm a national campaigner. I want MPs to back our amendments to make the industry pay and to remove this partial standard of PAS and make it, improve it to make sure we're not all screwed over. So this is what he says. So I'll bring out some of it. So it's Christmas Day in Greenwich East, but for Stevie, there is no feast. He's taken the mick out of the fact that I can't get any food. That bloody PAS, poor Stevie cries, mocking me for calling it out. And then he also mocks, I think it's the Earl of Lytton, because he's the only Earl that I know. He calls him the Duke of Hazard, and takes the mick out of him coming around to give me some turkey because he claims I don't have any money for turkey. But then this is the most chilling. He simply, this is me, fails to understand, and no one seems to lend a hand. So he's basically saying the reason that no one wants to engage with me on my serious national concerns is because I don't understand. I've got it all wrong. I'm not someone you should listen to. And he's saying the new PAS will make me weep even further. Well, yes, it does, because of what I've just shown you. And then he claims my software's full of bugs, which is terrible, really, because he's basically attacking my professional ability to code. I'm not going to go after him for it, but it's not great, is it? And then he mocks the insurers, and he basically says at the end, and I think I'll read this out, I might take less heed of dicks. Well, that's great, isn't it? And that's the producer of this standard. And I'll let Dom talk a little about his reactions now. But we had engagement with fire community, which mocked the BBC article, picked up on one typo online, which was swiftly corrected, and really didn't engage with the serious matters, and then went silent on us. But I'll hand back to you, Gareth, and maybe you can hear from Dom. But But you know, it's pretty shocking stuff, right?
It's incredible, actually. This is a person who's supposed to be a person of great majesty, as it were. But it seems there was only playground tactics here. Dominic, what's your thoughts on it?
What I'm quite interested in is I see it as a kind of question of narrative in terms of, and I've been getting more interested in looking at how the narrative and how policy making works. And interestingly, this week, Peter Apps, who's written a lot about Grenfell and building safety, he published a blog talking about all party parliamentary groups and how they can often be used as a hotbed for lobbying. And very coincidentally, I actually asked political commentator Grace Blakely on her Q&A, I asked her if she's ever seen kind of lobbying happening through these all-party parliamentary groups, and she said, well, look, yeah, it's pretty common. It's a kind of legitimate, it's a way of industry and lobbyists creating some kind of legitimacy about the narratives that they set, and obviously for that benefit. And then the other thing, there's kind of a very interesting comment that she made, and I can't sort of quote it precisely, but it's basically looking at the people involved in these processes and saying that when you look at these consultations and these groups that discuss and form policy, very much the balance of power in those is the same as it is in wider society. And so what I think was fascinating about watching this debate unfold online is you've obviously within the fire safety profession got a very clear split. Those who appear very defensive of the guidance, and those who are very concerned by the implications of risks being left, unidentified and unlooked at. And I sort of, stepping back a bit, viewed the defensiveness. I was trying to think how can I kind of get in the mind of a fire engineer who's coming on and defending something that I don't agree with, that I feel is kind of dangerous. People who are there meant to be making buildings safe are happy to go, okay, well that's too expensive to fix, so we'll leave it without any evidence supporting that decision. I was like, how could that happen? And then I was thinking, well, it is a technical profession. You've got these fire engineers who are put into these positions where they're the people saying yes or no. So that there's a sense of importance of that role. There's a sense probably of pride of the people who feel that they're doing that job well and they're exercising their judgment correctly. And they probably think, well, if I'm doing my job well and correctly and I've got good judgment and I'm very ethical, how possibly could other people try and game the system? And I can kind of understand that perspective. So you end up with this very polarizing discussion where there are people judging other people by their own standards. And the other comment that I find really interesting is someone said, and I can't remember who it was, but they said, look, it doesn't have to be kind of outright corruption in this, because I think one of the objections was that the kind of the BBC piece was sort of causing some kind of unfair attack on the profession. One particular person from the build to rent sector was saying, well, look, how are we going to recruit people into construction if people are putting out these kind of these damaging views? But I think that it's this sense of pride, it's this sense of thinking, well, if I'm using my judgment correctly, then how could someone else use it badly? And the comment that was interesting was someone saying, well, there's going to be, it doesn't have to be kind of outright corruption of, whatever that involves, like, brown envelopes getting handed around. But it can be, but he said there is going to be an undeniable skew. So there is you've got the hiring party of the developers. They want to spend as little money as possible. And you've got a fire engineer who is using their judgment and whose scope is, look, this has to be proportionate. But the other problem is, and this goes back to the narrative point, is that they're focusing it on this very much from the point of view of their narrow field of, right, I'm going to follow this assessment, these steps, these technical things, and if I do that, I've done my job. They've been educated in a way that is not looking at the bigger picture. And this is the most fascinating for me, is like, how are we so many years on and no one has acknowledged until very, very recently, and I'll come on to this in a minute, that the insurers play an important part in this. And this is where the narrative comes in. The kind of the building industry. Firstly, we've got a government desperate to build when we've got a very economy in very bad shape, for good reasons. They want to build. I think slightly misguided. I think they're sort of relying too much on building driving the economy. I think building should be a product of a good economy, and it feels like they've got that the wrong way around. But they're certainly desperate to build and think that's helpful. But obviously the builders aren't going to build in a market where people don't trust buying these properties and where they could be saddled with debt. So there's a very important part for government to regulate properly and hold to account. And the reason I'm interested in this kind of narrative side is Steve's been campaigning for this for a long time, but many people in and around government, including people who should be on the side of the consumer, have taken a stance that simply was the builders cannot be expected to build to standard. And that is why, you've got to kind of interrogate these things. Why is that assumption valid? Why shouldn't the assumption be that they can build to standard? Because we're talking about a physical thing that has design specifications. It's not something, obviously buildings age, but you use like appropriate materials to kind of create something that lasts. It just is an assumption that has been populated by government. And I've also challenged the APPG Secretariat a while ago, who put out that the idea of holding builders accountable for their mistakes to fix things properly, and Steve's solution would not work legally. And when I've challenged that point as to why, there's been no forthcoming answer. And it kind of, we spoke about Colin Todd, and you ask the questions and it resorts to silly poems that don't address the questions. But there's also other people who've been involved in who also can't ask questions that really there should be answers to. Because if people aren't interrogating these things, then you've got the building industry setting a narrative that is based on false assumptions that need to be challenged. And it comes down to this: the balance of power in these parliamentary processes is reflecting the balance of power in wider society. And that is something that is creating a situation, an unfair situation. And we've now got the unintended consequence that building in London has completely stalled, because people, there's a combination of the huge cost, the uncertainty over how things were built. There's also the foot dragging on leasehold reform, where a lot of people kind of, there's been a lot of recent questions in Parliament about that, about, well, actually, the people who've got to basically extend their leases, and some of the clear reforms would come in, and now, well, do I do that now or do I wait? Or, it's created a lot of uncertainty in the market that is essentially serving the balance of power of industry and not the balance of power of what are houses for, what are homes for. They're to provide people with safety and security. And I recently saw an interview with Steve Reed, sort of trying to push that narrative. He wasn't wearing his baseball cap with "Build Baby Build" on, but he was sort of saying how he really believed that he wants home ownership to be the aspiration for everyone. I personally think, I didn't feel like he was believing the words he was saying, but it's obviously the party line. But why does someone want to have an aspiration of owning part of a building where they've got unlimited liabilities for defects that they bought in good faith? I mean, and this is the crux of the problem. People have taken shortcuts, and that's actually another thing recently. Like, I actually wrote a Substack that Keir Starmer went on record saying, there's no shortcuts, there's no silly slogans. Sorry, Steve Reed, did you hear that? But they're not. They're saying those things, but they're not doing that in reality. They're taking the shortcuts, and it's creating a system where a home is not safe and secure, and where that's killing trust in the market they're trying to protect. So it's the worst of both worlds for everyone by trying to take shortcuts. And sorry, yeah, yeah.
All right,
Dom. I mean, one thing I would say just in response is that, you know, there's already law around defects and how we handle them, and that, you know, this is basically, this PAS becoming law would undermine that. And just to be I'll do it very quickly. You know, we put out you know, a little bit of an explanation on LinkedIn, and it's basically, there's two parts to the fire safety management of a building. There's the building regulations, which you've got to comply with, and then you've got on top of that the fire safety order, which the fire brigade use to basically manage the risk. But the assumption is that the building is built to the building regulations first, so it's legally built. So PAS is like a risk-based approach, like the fire safety order, that sits on top of the building being built legally. It almost assumes that the building is built legally, which is why I guess they might argue that they're discouraging investigation into the unlawful stuff, because it should have been done already and you shouldn't look into it. So what this PAS is doing is it's undermining the enforcing authorities, which are the councils and the fire services, which could issue an enforcement notice, basically saying, you know, ignore the fact the building could be built illegally, don't look into it, do not take action against developers and building owners that, you know, have built illegally. And it's almost well, it is overriding, if it becomes law, the enforcing authorities route to enforcement, and that is very sinister indeed. And
I've already had a head of a local authority building control has told me on record that they are having to leave in more combustibles than they would because of PAS. And you kind of wonder, well, look, if that's building control's job to make sure stuff is safe, and they're having to wave stuff through on the basis of a subjective guidance, yeah, that tells you a lot. It's really sort of, there's the kind of underlying law, but there's also the kind of, you know, judgment of people, the senior people within the system, that is being undermined. So it is creating a lot of problems, and it's actually the personal aspect of it is very difficult as well, because we're in a block that has a right to manage company, and I see a lot of the kind of, you know, leasehold reform type campaign stuff, and there are people that can't get a right to manage on their blocks who see that as a way that's going to kind of solve their problems. But actually having something subjective is causing people who are becoming directors of these RTM companies to kind of have to isolate themselves because of the pressure of having all these different parties to agree with. So I would say the emotional toll that it's playing on a lot of people as well is probably extremely significant. They're causing arguments where clarity and the existing standards solve them. They're actually, I would say that there's an extreme sort of harm of, you know, mental health as well for a lot of people.
And we have some good news, Gareth. We do have a proposal to fix all this.
Yes, we do.
So, because you always like a bit of positivity at the end,
please, please, a little bit.
So because of my work with the Lib Dems, you know, so we're going to be organising a Westminster Hall debate shortly to expose PAS 9980, and we're involving all the parties, inviting them. So we'll make, you know, that known when we have that date organised. But what we're suggesting is amendments, and I'm working with Gideon Amos's team. He's a housing spokesman. We've got some great names now coming to help us. Stephanie Barwise has been very vocal on our support. We've got David Sawtell. He's been advising us on the building safety legislation. We've got David Jones speaking out. We've got quite a following now of anti-PAS. I won't name them all, but, you know, anti-PAS sentiment out there. And it does seem to be quite a momentum building. So what we're saying is, rather than being withdrawn, we think PAS 9980 should be redrafted to, one, require the removal of all combustible material on residential buildings above 18 meters, with a few sort of caveats, exclusions like masonry wall insulation and so on, so you don't have to destroy all the walls. So there will be a small de minimis limit there, but largely to get rid of it all, because that speeds it all up. To require compliance with building regulations enforced at the time of construction, so that if these PAS assessments are done, they do not, as the PAS says currently in its revision, ignore or discourage investigations into surveying of unlawful construction. So we say you've got to look into it if you see evidence. And three, anything else that is classified as a building safety risk under the Building Safety Act needs to be remedied as a low as reasonably practical basis rather than tolerable, which will basically mean there's still some proportionality, but it is done to a much higher standard. And this is in line with the first tier tribunal, who actually have rejected currently, because they can, the tolerable risk standard in favor of a low risk standard. And there's been, I put it on my LinkedIn, but there's been a first tier tribunal case where they actually are very explicit that PAS doesn't go far enough. But what the government wants to do is remove that route. So that first tier tribunal wouldn't be able to say it's not good enough, PAS. They're going to have to say, well, PAS is all you've got because it's now law. That's what we need to stop. We'll be raising, and I'll be raising, and I know we will here and everywhere possible, these issues and suggesting these improvements in a hope to stop this becoming law. And I think our time frame is around August. I think the standard becomes published, looking at the BSI website. So the government's going to have to publish their draft remediation bill if they're going to do it between August and the end of Parliament. And we'll keep our eyes on it, and we'll be campaigning very hard to stop this happening. But the first thing...
We've had a comment, by the way. We've had a comment from David Jones. Article 2, public authorities should also consider your right to life when making decisions that might put you in danger and affect your life expectancy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. David Jones, shout out to him. He's the president of the Institute of Construction Management. So he's wonderful to have your support, David. And we'll hopefully get you on here at some point, and you can tell us more about your experiences. But yes, it's very, very important we fight this because effectively we are in a battle not only for building safety, it's a degradation of society. If you're going to say, yeah, just put in a law for vested interests that stand to lose a lot of money because they've made commercial decisions to put flammable material on buildings when they had an option not to. And instead of the government holding them to account, post Grenfell, post Hong Kong, post the recent fire in Switzerland, you know, Dagenham, all the rest of them, Lakanal House, and we're going to say as a society, let that industry off, then we have got more problems to come, because we are basically saying vested interests, companies, commercials, whatever it's called, these players are the ones that really count. Everyone else, even if they're large numbers.
I have to bring this to order. We're running out of time. Thank you, Steve. Dominic, do you have any last words before I pass back to Hamish?
I think just following on from Steve, I think it comes down to accountability. Like the people that build the homes need to be accountable for making sure they're safe and they meet standards. And if you avoid that, then then the games carry on and people's lives carry on being ruined.
All right, Hamish, would you care to take us home?
Yes, indeed. I mean, it does actually prove the point. We should be having adult conversations about this. This speaks for itself, but it's a little bit like this sort of situation. All of us understand that there are legal requirements within an MOT for a car. But it's being able to turn around effect, really saying, well, it doesn't really matter. I'll tell you what, I've carried out the MOT, the brakes have failed, the tyres are poor, but you just carry on driving anyway. Now, it's that particular sort of type of idea, and that's what we're actually being told to do. If your insurers are aware of, you try and get a claim out of an insurance company if you knowingly are driving a vehicle with bald tyres and ineffective brakes. And that's exactly what's happening with so many of these properties. Where Dom lives, where Steve lives. And also, as we said, if it was just in those individuals, but it's throughout the country, It's Scotland, England, Ireland, and Wales. They are all suffering in the same way. And but people are looking at the UK to actually see a sensible adult conversation about this. And as we've got so far, we are just getting ludicrous sort of, let's push it under the carpet, Let's just get on with life. If we can, if you don't go up in flames, basically is what we're saying.
Right. I totally get that. And thank you so much, Dean, for bringing this to us. And Dominic, thanks for being such a great supporter. And good luck with both of the work that both of you are doing. It's such valuable work. And Hamish, of course, who made this whole thing possible. And on to all of you watching, thank you for spending your time today and every Friday helping us put this word out there, getting it to the right people. We're not looking to cause anyone to be taken into disrepute. We're just trying to make sure that more people's lives are saved and that people have the right to life, and that's upheld. And unfortunately, the PAS 9980 standard isn't up to that. Even if you look at the definition of that standard, it said it should not be used if you want to have zero life loss. That's blows my mind. Thank you everyone for watching. Try and keep your feet on the ground. Keep reaching for the stars, and in this troubled time, look after your mental health. Thank you everyone. Bye-bye.